All right, guys, today we are looking at social progressivism, trying to help those that could not help themselves and fixing the problems after the Gilded Age in our society. The first thing we're going to look at is the social gospel, which was a movement that strove to improve conditions in cities according to biblical ideals of charity and justice. One of the early groups that we have is the Young Men's Christian Association, created by Dwight L. Moody, that looked to help industrial workers and the urban poor by organizing Bible studies and citizenship training and fitness activities to keep them busy. And if they're busy, they're not on the streets causing problems. A similar group is the Salvation Army, created first in the UK and then brought to America. And their focus was the undesirables of society, not just the poor, not just immigrants, but those that even the other groups were ignoring, such as alcoholics and opium addicts and prostitutes. The idea of this group was to try and fix society by the ideals listed in the Bible. Kind of going along this idea is this woman's group known as Hull House. Jane Addams created Hull House in Chicago as a place for immigrants and poor residents to go. It was a home that provided these poorer people with medical care, English classes, hot lunches, daycare services for their children. It was a place for women to be able to go to get a fresh start. A lot of these women came to America either by themselves or their husbands had died in a factory accident, or many of them also were leaving their husbands because they were abusive. And so this was a location they could go to that was safe, as well as provided them some skills to get on with their lives. Part of the idea of these changes is because we felt America had lost its morals during the Gilded Age. And so the first of these things we're going to look at is the Comstock laws, created by Anthony Comstock. The idea of this was to make it illegal to send any lewd, obscene, or lascivious materials through the mail, specifically contraceptive devices or information, as well as banning the distribution of information on abortion for educational purposes. They felt that this was going to bring back morals to America, but one woman in particular, Margaret Sanger, is going to be very much against it. She ended up creating the American Birth Control League, which would later become known as Planned Parenthood. And she did this because her mother had 18 pregnancies in 22 years and died at the age of 50 of cervical cancer. She felt that her mother did not have the information to not only be able to prevent unwanted pregnancies, which are incredibly hard on a woman's body, but also to know about her own sexual reproductive health. And she felt that was going to be more important than trying to prevent people from getting information about this type of thing. We are going to move on to the idea of the temperance movement, which is also kind of a moral idea, trying to stop people from drinking too heavily. But this is going to eventually evolve into the idea of prohibition, where we are going to completely abolish alcohol from America. One of these early groups that are one of these early leaders is going to be Carrie A. Nation. She was a very radical member of the temperance movement, largely because she had been married to an alcoholic herself. And she would actually promote her viewpoints through radical vandalism. She would go into bars, either alone or with her followers, and they would sing and chant with hymns as they smashed the bar to pieces with hatchets. She was even arrested 30 times in the state of Kansas for these types of hatchetations, as she called them. She was arrested in Kansas City, Missouri, after smashing up a series of bars, and the judge said that he would suspend her fine if she promised she would never come back to Missouri. Very kind of scary woman, but unfortunately her ideas just made people kind of afraid of the temperance movement, and it didn't really get a lot of support. So the group that's really going to have the biggest impact on this to gain steam and to gain credibility is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The idea of this group was to create a sober and pure world, and they saw alcoholism as a cause and consequence of larger social issues like unregulated immigration and the working poor. And so they saw that this was something that could be fixed. Large groups of women would go outside of bars, and like with Carrie Nation, they would sing hymns and read prayers to basically guilt men out of drinking in the bars. This group would kind of change their idea, though, when led by Frances Willard. She was interested in a number of social reform issues, including labor and public health, sanitation, as well as women's suffrage. And the reason was that she felt that if women have the right to vote, they could bring morality back to the country. She also felt that by expanding their views, they would gain more followers. Unfortunately, it also made them a little less strong in the idea of temperance. The group that was really the most successful is the Anti-Saloon League. They focused on legislation rather than on people's behavior. They went state by state trying to change laws, and then eventually demanded a national prohibition amendment to the Constitution. This group was the most popular in the South and in the rural North, as well as with Protestant churches like the Baptists and the Methodists. And they used emotion and patriotism to get people to follow them. And when World War I breaks out, they use anti-German sentiment to get people to follow, because the majority of America's beer brewers were German. They eventually achieved success in 1919 with the 18th Amendment, and it got a lot of women involved in political schemes, which puts us to women's suffrage. We've talked about this before with the Seneca Falls Convention and the women who kind of got it started, but it went on pause during the Civil War. But when the war was over, it kind of gets kick-started again. Women believed that they had been so involved in the abolitionist movement that they could have a political voice, but also they were angry and bitter because freed men, black men, had been given the right to vote, not middle-class white women. And so a group is going to kind of start to emerge as a leader, and that is NASA. It was originally led by Susan B. Anthony, and very similar to the Anti-Saloon League, they went with the idea of legislation, first state by state, then the idea of a national amendment to encourage women's suffrage. This group really gained steam under the leadership of Cherry Chapman Catt, who organized massive parades, as you see in the picture here, where they would promote the idea of women's suffrage. When they did eventually gain suffrage, she disbanded NASA and created the League of Women Voters, which is a group that still exists today. But for women to gain suffrage, the hardest part was convincing men that it was a good idea. There were a lot of people that were opposed to the idea because women who supported suffrage were seen as unfeminine or immoral. One woman in particular was actually against women's suffrage, Helen Kendrick Johnson, because she believed that women didn't need to vote because their husbands would make good choices for them. She also believed that women's role was in the domestic sphere, and that if women got involved in politics, it would not moralize the country, but it would demoralize women. She was highly involved in the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, trying to get people to actually vote against allowing women the right to vote. Now, if you want to see a woman who's really going to fight the good fight, though, that's this lady right here, Alice Paul. She had been a member of NASA, but didn't like how slow it was going with the state-by-state legislation, and she wanted to bring this to a national issue. And so she split from them, created the National Women's Party, and actually got her followers together, and they were the first group in America to picket the White House. Rain or shine, they were out there picketing the White House, and they were arrested many times. But the final time that they were arrested for, quote unquote, blocking the sidewalk, and it was a very violent occasion. These women were taken to a place called the Occoquan Workhouse, and Alice Paul went on a hunger strike. And since the authorities did not want a martyr on their hands, they force-fed her through a tube through her nose or down her throat. But the terrifying part was on November 15th, 1917, the Night of Terror, where the women of the Occoquan Workhouse, the suffragettes, were brutalized by the guards. They were beaten, they were kicked. Some of them even said that they had been molested or raped. Lucy Burns, who you see here, was chained to the cell bars above her head and then left there for the night. Others were thrown into their cells One in particular had her head smashed against an iron bed, which knocked her out. Her cellmate, who believed her to be dead, suffered a heart attack. It was a horrible event and caused great outcry amongst the country to make sure that this kind of thing did not happen again. And so in 1920, Woodrow Wilson signed the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And this is actually going to be a big focus of our class later on today. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you guys later.